Good afternoon and welcome. Let me just remind you, if you haven't turned your cell phones off or put on vibrate, you might want to remember to do that. And also, if we should need an additional emergency exit, there is one down the stairs here to my right. So thank you all for coming. We've been looking forward to this speaker and this day. My name is Lucy Wilkins, and I'm the Director of University Collections and Lee Chaplin Museum. On behalf of our department, let me welcome you to the 5th Annual Spring Lecture Series. Our speaker today is Dr. Jason Phillips from West Virginia University, where he is the Eberly Professor of Civil War Studies. He holds a PhD from Rice University, an MA from Wake Forest University, and a BA from the University of Richmond. So it was my alma mater, so he started out right. In addition to numerous articles, he has published 3 books: Die Hard Rebels, The Confederate Culture of Invincibility, Storytelling, History, and the Postmodern South, and the most recent on which his talk today is based, Looming Civil War, How 19th-Century Americans Imagined the Future. We often tend to think of history as static, which is why it often seems dusty and unrelated to our current lives. It's difficult to look at a particular period from the perspective of the people living in it, since we have the advantage, or perhaps the disadvantage, of hindsight. Dr. Phillips's book sees the world of the past as dynamic and living. His research gives us insight into what people were actually thinking about at the time. Dr. Phillips's book posits the idea that the way we think about the future actually affects how the future unfolds. As we look at how people in the past thought about the future, we can learn some lessons to apply to our own future. After his talk, Dr. Phillips' book will be available for purchase downstairs in the museum shop, and he'll be happy to sign your copy. Dr. Phillips will now come and share with us this remarkable and unusual way to look at the past, present, and future. Please welcome Dr. Phillips.
Thank you for inviting me to give this lecture. I'm especially grateful for all the help that everyone has given me in arranging my travel and putting together this event. And thank you all for coming today. As Lucy just mentioned, my lecture shares a couple of ideas with you. First, visions of the future, like memories of the past, are socially constructed. We cannot reach the future or the past, so we imagine them. Because historians are trained to look backward, my profession focuses on memories instead of anticipations. But forecasts are more powerful than memories because they come first. This is my second point for you today. Forecasts precede history and shape unfolding events. How society interprets news and acts in the present depends on its expectations of the future. To support these claims, I study the forecasts of America's most remembered event, the American Civil War. And by the end of the lecture, I hope to show you how Americans anticipated and dreaded this conflict and how their imagined futures made history. While his comrades in the Richmond Howitzers anticipated battle, Thompson Brown expected to die. Amid the excitement and whirl of preparations, Brown sat down to write his wife goodbye. He tried to express his love for her and asked her to take care of his mother. Looking to the future, he worried, "I hope I died a true Christian." Rumors spread that the enemy was planning a night assault, and the Howitzers had patrol duty from midnight to dawn. When Brown imagined the future, he saw his company ambushed by Northern gunmen. The crack of rifle fire would wake comrades in camp who were ordered to sleep beside their arms. But friends would arrive too late for the Howitzers, who would be far away, in the dark where the enemy waited for them. Civil War archives preserve similar premonitions, letters penned by men who sensed this one would be their last. But none of them precede Brown's letter, written on November 27th, 1859. Thompson Brown guarded Harper's Ferry from a northern invasion to rescue John Brown from the gallows. As execution day loomed, Virginians tensed for another attack. The colonel of the local militia telegrammed the state pleading for reinforcements. In minutes, electric current transferred his anxiety across the entire state. The excitement pulsed through Richmond that night as the city's militia formed. They were anticipating orders for departure to the scene of action, as one of the men put it. Newspapers reprinted the colonel's call, sending his clamor to towns that were still untouched by telegraph lines. Preparing for the worst, Governor Henry Wise flooded the area with troops. Thousands of soldiers walked the streets and scoured the countryside day and night for weeks. The spectacle attracted gawkers who came to Harper's Ferry and Charlestown to witness history. Business stopped, and people stood in their dooryards, swapping rumors and discussing the future. Nervous citizens noted that so many visitors had swarmed the town that the enemy might already have 1,000 secret agents walking the streets, waiting for the signal to attack. Weeks of tense fears snapped on November 27th when people saw flares in the sky. Southerners, who expected another raid, explained the heavenly signs. Yankee rescuers in the surrounding mountains were coordinating their assault on the town. When mounted pickets stormed into the howitzers' camp to report the blazing rockets, Thompson Brown picked up his pen and wrote his wife. The Civil War would begin with a midnight massacre in Western Virginia, and Thompson Brown expected to be its first casualty. Secessionist Edmund Ruffin wanted to believe those fires signaled the start of the Civil War. I wish that the abolitionists of the North may attempt a rescue, Ruffin confided in his diary on the same night that Thompson Brown expected to die. Whether successful or not, a bloody rescue attempt would trigger disunion and civil war. Ruffin was there, watching rockets rise in the sky, but he knew they were an illusion. He understood the flares were in fact local sparks from nearby chimneys. Something small, insignificant, and low appeared large, portentous, and high, because a dense layer of atmosphere bent rays of light from the sparks to create a superior mirage. This optical illusion refracted light beams and lifted them above their true position. Antebellum Americans called this phenomenon looming, a term dubbed by sailors who often experience the effect at sea, where refraction lifts land and ships into the sky. Superior mirages sparked seafaring legends like the Flying Dutchman. Ruffin first experienced looming years earlier when he thought he spied a large dark island in Chesapeake Bay. Had I not known that no such thing existed, Ruffin recalled, I should have guessed it to be a castle. Truth did not diminish the power of the illusion when someone told Ruffin he was looking at a duck blind. At Harper's Ferry, when atmospheric conditions were right and people's imaginations were stirred, all that was needed to produce panic and dire visions of a looming civil war was a literal spark. Looming offers a metaphor for how 19th century visions of the future formed, spread, and made history. First, some spark, an event or object, captured people's attention. Then, a unique atmosphere elevated and enlarged that spark, making it loom larger than reality. Finally, observers and visionaries focused on it and reported what appeared to be beyond the horizon. A series of sparks portended the Civil War. Bleeding Kansas, the Panic of 1857, Harper's Ferry, Lincoln's election, and secession sparked prophecies of different civil wars. When thoughts of impending wars coalesced, they depicted diverse conflicts depending on visionaries' perspectives. Looking west, Americans envisioned the Civil War as a border war for the frontier that would decide the direction of national ambitions. Looking east, Americans speculated about the Civil War as a class war between competing labor systems that would shape the nation's economic prospects. Looking south, Americans spread rumors of a civil war that would spark racial extermination. Looking abroad, Americans prophesied about the Civil War as a revolution that would be triggered by secession. When the Civil War began, all of these visions shaped how Americans perceived the looming conflict and fought it. Somehow the real war combined all of these antebellum prophecies without fulfilling any of them. How Americans understood time affected their visions of looming wars, and two prevailing temporalities coexisted in 19th century America. Now, before I get into the weeds here and explain their approach to time, let's do a quick experiment. By a show of hands, how many of you imagine that the future is behind you? Anyone? No? Indigenous South Americans imagine the future is behind their head because, unlike the past, we can't see the future or read about it. We can't know about it until it happens. The past is in front of them. It's something they can read about. Raise your hand if you think the future is ahead of you. Does anyone think the future is ahead of you? That's what I thought. Believing that the future is in front of us is a key metaphor that we live by, and it profoundly affects our history, culture, politics, science, and economy. Civil War Americans shared our view that the future was ahead of them, but they related to that future in different ways. Some people imagined themselves traveling through time toward the future and forging that future and their lives in the process. For these Americans, the future was open, it was empty, opportunities abounded, and humanity made history. This modern temporality, defined as anticipation, believed in progress and free will. Others imagined themselves stationary while time passed through them. The future remained ahead, but instead of moving toward it, these people waited for the future to arrive day after day. Instead of focusing on an open future, these Americans imagined a closed future that large forces, impersonal and perhaps divine, had already determined. This older temporality, defined as expectation, privileged providence and fate. Religion shaped how antebellum Americans imagined the future. Millions of citizens believed that Jesus Christ's second coming would occur during their lifetime. This was not a fringe faith. Beliefs about approaching the end of history colored how Americans envisioned territorial disputes, immigration, economic depressions, slave revolts, political debates, and of course, the Civil War. New technology also affected how people understood time. The telegraph reinforced notions that humanity formed the center of the universe and affected eternity like a stone thrown into a pond. In 1850, Edward Hitchcock, who was then the president of Amherst College, argued that all our thoughts are transmitted to every part of the universe through what he called the universal telegraph. Hitchcock's friend, Theodore Parker, was the first to say that the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. And this is what he meant. The universal telegraph preserves everything we say, do, and think for eternity. And over time, our goodness will literally reform the material of the cosmos. If the telegraph suggested the permanence of human action in the future, the railroad simulated time travel. Asa Whitney recorded his first experience on board a train in 1844. And I had to look and see exactly how fast he was going. His train was going about 20 miles an hour. This is what he said. Time and space are annihilated by steam. We pass through a city, a town, yea, a country, like an arrow from Jupiter's bow. Like the telegraph, the railroad focused attention on the future. The mind, too, goes with all this, Whitney said. It speculates, theorizes, and measures all things by locomotive speed. His day on the train gave Whitney new respect for religious groups that predicted humanity was approaching the apocalypse. The telegraph changed how people imagined cause and effect. The railroad turned people's thoughts toward the end of the line. Antebellum inventions favored anticipations and labeled them as masculine. Women waited for the future to arrive in the form of a marriage proposal or the birth of a child. Pregnant women were expecting, not anticipating. Men, however, molded the future with ambition and work. Masculinity meant winning at the race of life, which required a go-ahead attitude. A forgotten phrase today, go ahead, was a 19th century American mantra. In 1859, Bartlett's dictionary defined go ahead as rapidly advancing progressive, harnessing the ambition and power to move forward was what Americans sought and how they distinguished themselves from other people. All of these changes marked modernity and strengthened faith that a single person or a small group could make history. When anticipations replaced expectations as the dominant temporality, they empowered some groups at the expense of others. Northern reformers, Western boosters, and Southern nationalists captured the temporal outlook of the times by taking matters into their own hands and shaping the future. These temporal changes also increased sectionalism by favoring radicals in both regions. In the North, abolitionists like John Brown, who advocated violence and political involvement, gained credibility over their colleagues who preferred prayer. In the South, immediate secessionists like Edmund Ruffin urged disunion before the federal government attacked slavery and branded everyone who opposed them submissionists. By 1860, social conservatives and political compromisers seemed out of step with the times. This wave of anticipation peaked with Abraham Lincoln's election, Deep South secession, and the war fever that followed Fort Sumter. Ruffin was so confident in secession and Confederate victory that he published a history of the Civil War in 1860. Titled Anticipations of the Future, his book predicted Confederate independence would be the result of Southern bravery, slave loyalty, and the failures of the North's free labor capitalism. When secessionist visions started to materialize in 1860, people convinced themselves that the prospect that loomed on the horizon was real and achievable. The mirage wraps you round, Lawrence Keat reported from the Confederate founding in Montgomery. Sail on and you meet the ship you saw in the air. He's talking about looming. Keat observed, forward is the inexorable word in the world. There we go. In 1861, after generations of worrying and dreaming about the Civil War, it finally came. And when it did, people used their visions of the future to read the news and make history. Forecasts of a 90-day war, vows that one recruit could whip 10 enemies, promises to drink all the blood spilled by secession. Such sentiments anticipated a short, romantic war. These boasts also shared popular anticipations that people controlled the future, and whoever reached the war first would make history. Battlefields offered an open prospect and beckoned to men who had the foresight and courage to reach them first. When the war came, Theodore Winthrop joined the 7th New York Infantry, a unit brimming with elite New Yorkers who shared his conviction that the path to victory lies straight ahead. They wore gray uniforms with white cross belts and Bowie knives and enlisted for 30 days. The regiment was the first in the city to go to war. On April 19th, they tramped down Broadway under a bower of flags. Winthrop and the 7th answered Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers. Now, some historians have misinterpreted this call as proof that even Lincoln underestimated the scale of the Civil War. When Lincoln asked for only 75,000 men, he followed the advice of General Winfield Scott, who anticipated that a massive muster would give the government more men than it could handle and provoke the Upper South to secede. Other historians insist that Lincoln's call for 90-day enlistments illustrates his faith in a short war. This, too, is incorrect. A 1795 militia law limited the service of volunteers to 30 days after the assembling of Congress. When Lincoln's proclamation called Congress to a special session on July 4th, it thus limited the enlistments to about 90 days. To convene Congress earlier would have shortened the volunteer service. To postpone Congress's return would have slowed mobilization. When the 7th finished its short term of service and mustered out, Winthrop transferred to Fort Monroe to serve as General Benjamin Butler's secretary. The move satisfied his eagerness to travel straight to the seat of war. "By liberty," he wrote, "but it is worth something to be here at this moment, in the center of the center. Here we scheme the schemes," and all of this is in exclamation points. "Here we take the secession flags, the arms, the prisoners. Here we liberate the slaves," virtually. Winthrop was anticipating events. The garrison had not captured flags, weapons, or prisoners yet. After he arrived at the fort, Winthrop convinced Butler to let him plan a surprise attack against nearby Confederates. His plan called for 2 regiments to coordinate separate marches at midnight, meet in front of the enemy's position at dawn, fire a single volley, and charge with bayonets. Winthrop's plan would have tested the abilities of veterans, and his men had never seen battle. When the 2 regiments met in the dark, they thought they were encountering the enemy and fired at each other. This mistake wounded 21 men and erased the element of surprise. After the officers regained order, they wanted to return to the fort because their plan was compromised. Winthrop convinced them to press forward. The march took longer than expected, and Confederates had hours to prepare for their arrival. When Winthrop and his men appeared at the Confederate position around noon the next day, a shower of rebel bullets welcomed them. Winthrop hid behind a fallen tree and told the soldier next to him that he would see inside that enemy trench before he returned to Fort Monroe. When ordered to retreat, Winthrop instead stood up on the log and urged his men to come on. A North Carolinian shot him through the chest. Winthrop's ability to march forward to the future ended yards from the Confederate line. With eerie irony, Winthrop had anticipated his death 10 years earlier in a poem he wrote. Let me not waste in skirmishes my power, in petty struggles. Rather, in the hour of deadly conflict, may I nobly die. In my first battle, perish gloriously. Winthrop was the first Civil War officer killed in combat. When Winthrop's men stumbled in the dark that night, they encountered a group of runaway slaves who asked which way it was to the Freedom Fort. Fort Monroe was an emancipation magnet, years before Lincoln freed any slaves. In 1861, enslaved Americans who raced toward the war seeking freedom expressed anticipations of an open future that rewarded courage and enterprise. On May 23rd, the day that Edmund Ruffin and other Virginians celebrated their state's official ratification of secession, 3 enslaved men, Frank Baker, Shepard Mallory, and James Townsend, anticipated freedom and grasped it. While white Virginians toasted their entrance into the Confederacy, Baker, Mallory, and Townsend commandeered a boat and rowed 4 miles across the estuary to Fort Monroe. 12,000 Union soldiers garrisoned the old stronghold. Baker, Mallory, and Townsend had worked at Sewell's Point, digging artillery emplacements aimed at the Yankee fort. Their master, Confederate Colonel Charles Mallory, sensed the danger of leaving them within sight of the enemy and told them he planned to take them to North Carolina, where they could work for the Confederacy at a safer distance from the Yankees. All 3 men had families in the area, and moving to another state had no appeal to them. Seeking a better future for themselves across the bay, they had no assurance that Union guards would allow them inside the fort. Rowing toward Union pickets at night, the men risked being shot. Friends and family anxiously waited to see if Baker, Mallory, and Townsend returned. Soldiers asked the runaways if more were coming, and the black men said if they were not sent back, others would understand that they were among friends, and more would come the next day. Scores of slaves followed. Such is the mysterious spiritual telegraph which runs through the slave population, a soldier observed. Proclaim an edict of emancipation in the hearing of a single slave on the Potomac, and in a few days it will be known by his brethren on the Gulf. Harry Jarvis heard the news and seized the chance to escape his master, who was known as the meanest man on the Eastern Shore. Conditions on the plantation deteriorated after the war came. The day his owner shot at him, Jarvis reckoned it was time to leave. Hunted by patrols and dogs for 3 weeks, Jarvis relied on friends for news and food while he hid in the woods. When his master posted men along the shoreline to catch him if he tried to escape to Fort Monroe, Jarvis waited until his master's birthday. I knew they'd all be drinking and carousing night and day, and all the servants be kept home, so I took the opportunity to slip down to the shore in the night, got a canoe and a sail, and started for Fort Monroe. Out on the water, a storm raged over his little boat. But Jarvis was not afraid. It was death behind me, and I didn't know what was ahead. I just asked the Lord to take care of me, and by, the wind went down to a good, steady breeze straight for Old Point. Jarvis arrived at Fort Monroe the next morning and told General Butler he wanted to enlist. Butler said it was not a black man's war. Jarvis predicted it would be a black man's war before they got through. While Butler envisioned a short romantic war for the Union, Jarvis anticipated a long, destructive war that would require black soldiers and kill slavery in the process. Not content to labor for the federal government in exchange for food and shelter, Jarvis wanted a uniform and pay. The future could not arrive fast enough for him. When he saw a fugitive slave at Fort Monroe return to his master, Jarvis decided it was time to move on. He hired on a ship going to Cuba, and then on another one going to Africa, and he was gone for 2 years. When he returned in 1863, his prophecy was fulfilled. The Union Army was enlisting African Americans, and Jarvis joined one of the first black regiments. When black Southerners like Jarvis raced to Union lines, they revealed something that most Americans had not realized about the looming war. The future would unfold where fugitive slaves met federal authorities, not simply where Union soldiers fought Confederate troops. Thousands of Americans shared Jarvis's vision of a long, destructive war. On April 11th, 1861, this is the eve of the conflict, the day before the firing on Fort Sumter, Arthur Carpenter wished for a long, terrible struggle to restore the Republic's virtues. I believe that a war of 5 or 10 years would be a great thing, he said. It would purge our nation of some of its filth and deadheads, and then we should be ready to commence anew. A 20-year-old shoemaker's apprentice from Indiana, Carpenter imagined war as a contest that exposed, in his words, fops and light-brained scoundrels in high places. And it would replace them with natural leaders, men, of course, like himself. South Carolinian Jesse Reed agreed. Big men seem willing to drink all the blood that will be spilled by this war, he noted. And I think they will have to be as big as they feel before they do so. Politicians will not be able to take the whole battle, he said, the whole bottle of blood. It's gross. He said, time will show. In Ohio, James Garfield, future president, echoed Reed's predictions. He could see no possible end to the war. There can be no doubt that we are now entering upon a terrible and bloody war. Garfield was prepared to sacrifice 1 million lives for the Union. When the war acquired its own momentum and killed hundreds of thousands, it undercut American confidence that individuals made history by anticipating events and fashioning the future. The destructive indecision of military campaigns challenged people's faith in progress. Facing uncertainty, some Americans hoped that God crafted the war and would provide a meaningful ending to it. Others doubted that the Almighty was responsible for such carnage and waste. For doubters, the war defied all linear narratives towards civilization or the millennium. Whatever fate awaited America, people sensed that the war's outcome would arrive in its own time and on its own terms. Instead of anticipating a glorious war that would revitalize the nation, thousands expected a ruinous conflict that would spin out of control. When Fort Sumter fell, college student Andrew McCullum wrote, "There can be no doubt that the most destructive and bloody war has been inaugurated at Charleston." He predicted every citizen coming under the militia law will eventually have to go. Women from across the nation expressed dreadful predictions about the war's destruction and duration. Dante never saw more clearly the tortures of the damned than I have the possibilities of the future. Grace Elmore wrote that. She imagined her brother dead on the battlefield, her mother shorn of wealth in old age, her family scattered. Untold thousands of women envisioned similar tragedies. Not everyone who expected the war sensed approaching death. Many dreaded anarchy. Others feared a financial collapse. People who sympathized with the opposite region, like New York conservatives and Virginia unionists, feared that warring parties dragged them and the nation into a senseless struggle. Other people expected nothing specific, but felt a sickening feeling about the war and knew by premonition that it controlled their fate and their families' futures. All of these visions of the looming war shared a dreadful feeling that the future rushed toward them, and they were powerless to avoid it. Even people at the center of activity, like Abraham Lincoln's secretary, John Nicolay, confessed, "Events are crowding so thickly upon us that it is impossible to calculate their present or future importance." At different points in the conflict, all sorts of Americans felt this way, from generals and statesmen to common soldiers, from women at home to refugees on the road, from former slaves to Wall Street speculators. In June of 1861, Carrie Fries of North Carolina thought women's hardest struggle is after the excitement of preparation is over and they are left to await the future as best they can. Fries sewed uniforms for departing volunteers, but after the men left, she said, "The loneliness is really painful. You can form no idea of it." The day her brother and uncle left for war, Kate Stone sensed the weary days of watching and waiting that stretched before us. Stone understood that volunteers could anticipate the future, march toward it, and buoy their spirits with new scenery, excitement, and the satisfaction of performing duties. The war compelled women who stayed behind to expect the future. Fate would come when either their men returned or news of their deaths arrived. Telegraph operators shared women's tortured position. When Washington requested the best operators that the Pennsylvania Railroad could spare, Andrew Carnegie personally escorted his 4 best men to the Capitol. One of them, David Homer Bates, the man who's pictured on the right, recalled the stress of waiting for arriving dispatches. His title, telegraph operator, privileged the slim fraction of time he spent tapping messages on the machine. Listener was a more accurate depiction and description of his work. He and other operators spent endless hours straining to hear approaching news. Civil War expectations literally imprisoned Homer Bates. At the start of the war, he worked at the Navy Yard near Washington, D.C. Authorities placed an armed sentry outside the door of his solitary telegraph office. No one was permitted to disturb the operator. "These orders," he said, "were obeyed literally, and for 4 days I was a virtual prisoner," Bates recalled. The guard who was posted outside of his door would pass him meager meals. Bates waited and waited. Unable to stand it any longer, on the 5th day, he locked the door, opened a window, and escaped. When he returned and unlocked the door, the sentry appeared and said he would shoot Bates if he repeated the stunt. The strain of waiting for the future to arrive took its toll on men in the telegraph office. The first manager of telegraph operators in the War Department, a man named John Strauss, worked himself to death. He began the war in poor health and did not last a year. The second superintendent resigned instead of facing the same fate. The third, Major Thomas Eckert, the man pictured on the left, was a titan, physically and mentally. As a young man, he traveled from Ohio to New York City to see Samuel Morse's invention in person, and then built his own telegraph from memory when he returned home. When a War Department clerk bought cheap iron pokers, Eckert proved their inferiority by breaking them over his flexed forearm. Only men like Eckert survived as telegraph operators. Bursts of sound interrupted tense expectations when a telegram arrived over the wire. The message came one letter at a time, punctuated by dramatic pauses. As the operator transcribed the dispatch from Morse code to English, he capitalized words that he deemed important, because the message did not appear in distinct thoughts and sentences. Instead of unfolding in order with syntax, the message arrived as a matrix of words with 5, 6, or even 7 columns and lines. These blocks of text included blind words, extra text basically intended to confuse enemy interceptors. There was also a key word in every message that revealed the order and direction in which the matrix should be rewritten. The future arrived as nonsensical garble, and operators literally deciphered it. Even decoded messages contained uncertainty. The truncated prose of telegrams could torment a recipient. A telegraphic messenger wrote Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. the night after Antietam to announce, "Captain Holmes wounded, shot through the neck, thought not mortal, at Keedysville." The message haunted Holmes for days. Was his son's wound thought not mortal or not thought mortal? He wondered. As the doctor rumbled south on a train, locomotion stirred thoughts about the wound. Windpipe, food pipe, carotid, jugular, a great braid of nerves, spinal cord. A bullet through the neck ought to kill at once. For days, Holmes had only the same 12 words from the telegram to interpret his son's fate. Abraham Lincoln expected the future by temperament, and he haunted the telegraph office. Most days he left the White House, walked to the War Department, and sat at Major Eckert's desk, waiting for the future to unfold. "I believe I feel trouble in the air before it comes," he told his aide after spending a night in the telegraph office reading dispatches from the front. During the summer of 1862, he sat at Eckert's desk and wrote on foolscap. Like the operators, Lincoln wrote in short bursts and long pauses. Arriving telegrams interrupted his work, but the silence of the place provided a better writing space than the White House. Each night, Eckert locked Lincoln's writing in his desk drawer without reading it. Once, while writing, Lincoln looked out the window and spotted a giant spider web between the windowsill and the portico. Eckert joked that the operators called the colony of spiders Major Eckert's lieutenants and assured Lincoln that they would report soon. According to Bates, not long after, a big spider appeared at the crossroads and tapped several times on the strands, whereupon 5 or 6 others came out from different directions. When Eckert and his men looked at the web, they saw operators and wires transmitting messages. Lincoln did not share what he saw in the web. Maybe he saw the war with its web of contingencies touching everywhere and restricting everyone. Perhaps he saw slavery ensnaring the nation. Sitting in the telegraph office, waiting for the future in 1862, Abraham Lincoln was writing the Emancipation Proclamation. It seems paradoxical that Lincoln, the great emancipator, attributed unfolding events to God or fate. If any individual could claim control of the war, it was the president. Yet he explained, "I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me." When the war entered its third year, the nation's condition is not what either party or any man devised or expected. God, Lincoln said, alone can claim it. Because he lived with expectancy, sensing how the future approached him like waves reaching a shore, Lincoln focused on external forces, invisible elements that affected people and made history. After the Civil War, Americans forgot. They forgot how they expected it. The broad antebellum horizons with its diverse predictions shrank in hindsight. Society replaced its complex visions of looming border wars, economic clashes, racial strife, revolutions, and apocalypse with a simple myth that claimed no one knew the war would be long and bloody. After the fact, Americans convinced themselves that everyone looked forward to a lark. According to this short war myth, the war would be a brief, bracing adventure that invigorated the nation. Before bloodshed, thousands of people did anticipate a romantic war, but thousands of other people expected the worst. The short war myth overshadowed the dread that women felt. It ignored the dire warnings of conservatives and bordermen who sensed the approaching destruction. It erased the hopes of millions of African Americans who prayed for a cataclysm to kill slavery. For many reasons, people's post-war memories differed from their antebellum forecasts of the conflict. The trauma, power, and duration of the war changed the world and how people viewed it. Understanding and expressing those changes must have been difficult for survivors. I cannot believe I am the same person that was ever so lighthearted and hopeful in the future, wrote a widow in 1865. By focusing on the most mistaken prediction of 1861, people admitted they did not know the future as well as they thought. Centering on the war's enthusiastic anticipators also privileged the perspectives of hundreds of thousands of volunteers. The short war myth honored the heroism of recruits who marched to war as boys in 1861 and returned home as men in 1865 if they came home at all. The Civil War, because of the short war myth, became a coming-of-age story about the people who fought it and the nation that endured it. Beyond expressing the war's chasm between antebellum and post-war life, the short war myth appealed to Americans because it reconciled the North and South. Neither side could be blamed for causing the war if everyone misread its portents. No one bore responsibility for its death and destruction if all expected a short, bloodless party. Evidence abounds that antebellum Americans imagined wars that exceeded the Civil War in power and duration. People expected Armageddon, forecasted racial extinctions, predicted revolutions bloodier than the French, and even wished for a long, destructive war to purge America of sin. The short war myth also prevails because of its seductive narrative. It ensures the deep poetic structure of Civil War history. Ken Burns introduced the short war myth to millions of Americans in his wonderful documentary film. Bruce Catton used the short war myth to great effect in his popular centennial history of the war. This may or may not have been the end of Americans' golden age, Catton wrote, but it was at least the final haunted moment of its age of innocence. For African Americans, the Civil War ended an age of wickedness, not innocence. Instead of anticipating a party when the war began, slaves expected an answer to their prayers. Recalling his life enslaved to the Brent family in Richmond, Thomas Johnson remembered anxiety, rumors, and biblical readings rippling through the Black community as antebellum events unfolded. Despite learning to spell and write in secret, Johnson thought the door to freedom seemed as much closed as ever in the 1850s. A large map of the United States hung in his master's dining room. While cleaning the room, Johnson would study the names of every city along the rail line from Richmond to Boston. Often I wondered whether I would ever see these cities where all were free. Freedom finally arrived when the Union Army entered Richmond on April 3rd, 1865. That scene of years ago comes up vividly before me at this moment, Johnson wrote, at the turn of the century. Men and women wept and praised God. Black people danced in the streets, played instruments, climbed trees, yelled at the top of their lungs, and gave impromptu speeches to gathering crowds. The long night of affliction in the house of our bondage had passed, Johnson wrote. That deeply desired and hoped for and prayed for time had come. When Johnson remembered the Civil War, he explained its origins as a divine reckoning. The innocent blood of murdered men and women and children had cried unto God from the ground, and he, in his own time, which is always the right time and best time, and in his own way, which is the very best way, answered that cry. Johnson told people he was born 3 times. In 1834 as a thing, mere chattel. In 1857 as a Christian. And in 1865 as a free man. People are not responsible for their own births. Johnson did not take credit for the events that defined his life. God and the future had blessed him. Thank you.
Dr. Phillips is willing to take some questions, and we'll be glad to hand you a microphone. Anybody have any questions?
Yes, it's a sort of a question of historiography, I guess. It seems that the historical view of the Civil War in the last 20 or 30 years has become more focused on the suffering and less on the strategies and battles. Is that correct? And how would you describe that shift?
So there is what historians have called the dark turn in Civil War historiography of the past 20 years or so that has focused more on the suffering on the home front and the war front. And I would suspect that, yes, that is the case. There are still plenty of historians who write and study military strategy and tactics. But I would suspect, if I were to put my finger on it, that our long-enduring wars in the Middle East and the number of disabled veterans coming home has kind of raised our awareness of sort of the darker side and the long-term costs of warfare, yes. Thank you for your question.
You touched on this quite a bit, but I was wondering how those who had an expectation view of the future, how that influenced their feeling of how to deal with the fact that many of them believed that Providence was on their side, and for Southerners, then what happened to Providence's support? after the war? How did they, how do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, the question is a good one, and certainly people on both sides thought God was on their side. And for Southerners who were committed to the cause, the Southerners I wrote about in my first book, Die Hard Rebels, had a very hard time reconciling their religious beliefs with what they read in the newspaper after Lee's surrender and then the end of the war. Many of them even questioned their faith in God before they questioned their faith that they were on the right side. But in the long term, I think Southerners who remain committed to the Confederacy and its cause argue that, well, perhaps there's meaning that we're not seeing in our defeat, right? That God must have another plan for us, and much of the lost cause view, it kind of builds on this notion that in suffering, we're going to sort of transcend our sins and become more powerful people in the future, and then the South will rise again.
Lee certainly made some statements in that line.
Right, yeah.
Anybody else?
I actually have one. I know there's some significance to the painting that you used on the cover of your book. If you'd like to.
I can go back to this here. Bear with me. More. There. So this is a painting by Edwin Church from 1861. This is not the entire painting. They zoomed in a little bit for the design of the cover, but it's called Our Banner in the Sky. And if you look, you can sort of see near the LO of Looming, there's a blue field with some stars in it, and then some red streaming sunset clouds after that. This was supposed to be a sign from God in 1861 that the United States would win the Civil War and remain a united country. It was a very popular painting. When I learned about this painting a number of years ago, when I started on this project, I thought, I've got to find a way to get this painting into the book, and Oxford did a great job of designing the cover with it. For you students out there, if you are interested in more about this book, I was walking your beautiful campus last night and decided on a whim to go check out your library and see if Looming Civil War is in the stacks, and it is. It is available for you to check out. Call number E169.1. So you can be the first to grab a free copy and literally check it out on your own. Any other questions?